Fleetwood Mac has been an innovative leader in rock music for more than 4 decades. Despite perpetual conflict and troubled personal lives, Mick Fleetwood and John McVie have remained the band's anchors, always directing its music along new and challenging roads. Through changing lineups that have included 16 different musicians, recurrent bouts of alcohol and drug addiction, stormy relationships, bitter breakups and reconciliations, Fleetwood Mac has alternately risen to moments of musical greatness and collapsed in total disarray.
Nothing to lose.
Leads you to where you are today.
I believe in storytelling.
It's gonna make you a star.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
For more than 40 years, legendary supergroup Fleetwood Mac, led by drummer Mick Fleetwood and bass player John McVie, has been churning out music the world adores.
When you're flipping and press and seek and a Fleetwood Mac song comes on, you don't keep pressing. You listen to that song. I don't know anybody who doesn't. That's gotta say something.
You couldn't help but be swept away by it. It really was great music for the time. You know, them and the Eagles really helped represent what was going on in the 70s.
It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing their fans stick with them as long as they do, too. I mean, Stevie's fans are just, you know, die-hard. Fleetwood Mac fans are.
It was just an interesting band and I think reflected the times and the musical times. And full of strong personalities that had a lot of interesting things to say.
One of the 5 or 10 groups that represents pop music in the 20th century, the mid-20th century, I think.
Fleetwood Mac are the group with the most important personnel changes in rock history.
But walking hand in hand with mega success has been the Achilles heel of the supergroup, internal turmoil and debauched excess. Fleetwood Mac's origins were unexpected and turbulent, a trend that would follow them for the next 4 decades. In January 1963, 17-year-old bass player John McVie joined a group known as the Blues Breakers, a cutting-edge band led by vocalist John Mayall. McVie's heavy drinking would cost him his job on several occasions, but Mayall always rehired him to play along with such future greats as lead guitarist Eric Clapton. When Clapton left the band in 1967, Mayall hired 19-year-old Peter Green. Having played professionally since he was 15, the teenage Green was already a renowned blues guitarist, often referred to as the Green God. Thrilled at being selected to join Mayall, Green insisted he would perform better if he could bring in an old friend who played drums with him in several bands. Mayall was reluctant to fire his longtime drummer Ainsley Dunbar, but he was keen to keep Green happy, so he eventually agreed, and Mick Fleetwood joined the band. A few months later, Mayall gave Peter Green several hours of free studio time as a birthday present. When he went to the studio, Green invited Mick Fleetwood and bass player John McVie to go with him. After the session, the recordings were quietly shelved, and the guys went back to playing with Mayall, partying and drinking to excess. Only a few weeks later, Mick Fleetwood's drinking, which was even more notorious than McVie's, got him fired from the Blues Breakers. Unlike McVie, Fleetwood was not invited back.
The reason Mick told me that he was kicked out of John Mayall's Blues Breakers was because he was constantly drunk on stage.
When Eric Clapton expressed an interest in returning to the Blues Breakers, Peter Green followed Mick Fleetwood out the door. He immediately called Fleetwood and suggested they form their own band, and together they hired a bass player, Bob Bruning, and a second guitar player, Jeremy Spencer.
Jeremy had a little band up in where he came from, just outside of Birmingham, called the Levy Set, and he'd been spotted by record producer Mike Vernon and introduced to Peter as a possible member of his band. So that's how Jeremy became a member of the band.
Mick and Peter were keen to replace their bass player, Bob Bruning, the man they wanted, was John McVie. Green even named the band Fleetwood Mac as an enticement.
I think being a former tax office inspector, he was used to a weekly salary that he received from John Mayall, so he didn't initially join for that reason.
McVie held out for almost 2 months before he agreed to join the band, replacing stand-in bass player Bob Bruning.
I went to see them on two successive nights. And the first night they came out and they were absolutely brilliant. And the second night I came back and it was an off night, and I think maybe the bottle had been passed around, you know. And I witnessed a completely different band. It was the funniest thing I'd ever seen.
Their lineup, which included Green, Spencer, McVie, and Fleetwood, released its debut single, I Believe My Time Ain't Long, only a month later. The song never made it into the charts, but their first album, an all-blues compilation, Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, was released the following February and became a massive UK success.
They were all over in the jukebox, particularly a song called Oh Well. So when we were traveling and doing our little shows, I loved that song. And I still do. In fact, I still do it live when I do live performances, because I actually somehow feel, and it's statistically true, I think, that I performed that song probably live more often than the guy who wrote it did, Pete Green.
Can't help about the shape I'm in. I can't sing, I ain't pretty, and my legs are thin. But don't ask me what I think of you. I might not give the answer that you want me to.
Peter Green sort of encapsulated everything that I loved in a guitarist. He could be flashy when he wanted to, but he was very controlled, and his tone and his tastes were just impeccable. You know, I thought, that's the way I want to play guitar, you know.
His guitar playing was poetic, and you realize that this guy could say more with notes than he could with words. And he was potentially one of the great guitarists of rock.
For their follow-up album, Mr. Wonderful, released only 7 months later, in August 1969, the band decided to give their music added depth by asking Chicken Shack's keyboard player Christine Perfect to guest for them. They also added a third lead guitarist, Danny Kerwin, and the new lineup released Kerwin's now classic Albatross.
In one day, we sold 64,000 units. 64,000 units. In 1969, my band Fleetwood Mac sold more records worldwide than the Beatles and the Rolling Stones put together.
No band in Great Britain was as hot as Fleetwood Mac, and it seemed nothing could stop them. Or could it? Because lying in wait were demons, demons which would gnaw at the band for years to come. By the end of 1969, Fleetwood Mac had produced 4 successful albums and were the hottest band in the UK and Europe. The Beatles even courted them to sign a deal with Apple, but Fleetwood Mac had gone with Warner Brothers, and through them released their next album, Then Play On.
It's the biggest act Warner Brothers ever had.
The first sign of trouble began during the Then Play On World Tour in early 1970. While in New York, founding member Peter Green suffered a devastating mental and emotional breakdown.
I mean, everybody says, oh, well, he must have drunk too much, or must have taken too many drugs, or he must have been religious, or... Well, let's hear it from him. All we know is he lost it.
And I'll never forget, Pete had, I've told the story before, but he had a piece of, I think it was Care Philly cheese, you know, the white English cheese, in his front forelock. When he arrived on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday goes by, and he leaves, gets ready to leave. The piece of cheese is still there in his hair after 4 days. I mean, the guy was like, Pete was out there. But and then that was the same day he later went over to Eric Clapton's house, who was close to there, a couple miles away, hitched a ride, and tried to climb over Clapton's wall while he wasn't there.
He was diagnosed as being schizophrenic, and Danny Kerwin at the same time. It turned out that both of them had been to a party in Munich sometime prior to that, and both had their drink spiked. And Danny Kerwin was paranoid schizophrenic, and Peter was a schizophrenic.
Within months, Peter Green became a virtual recluse, refused to perform, and finally left the band. Determined to continue without him, Fleetwood Mac recorded a fifth album, Kiln House, in 1970. To fill in the gap left by Green's absence, they called on keyboard player Christine Perfect, who had guested on their 1967 album, Mr. Wonderful. It seemed as though Fleetwood Mac had finally found their ideal sound and a stable lineup. They played together, toured together, and partied together, all without any apparent sign of strain. At least until the 5th of February 1971, when Jeremy Spencer went out to get a magazine. The band was on tour in LA, and during a sound check, Spencer popped out saying he would be right back. He never returned. And weeks later, he was discovered living with a religious cult known as the Children of God.
I remember that happening, and because at that time there were so many hippie cults and people just called themselves names, like terrorist groups in the Mideast do now, and you never know how many people are actually in them. Children of God sounds like a lot of people, but maybe it's 10, I don't know.
I went into the building and there was about 600 people chanting at me. I mean, it was quite frightening. And anyway, I stood my ground and I just said, look, you know, I don't want to cause any problems. I understand Jeremy Spencer is here. All I want to do is I want to see him on my own, and I want to ask him if he's here of his own free will, without all this. After about 3 hours of negotiating, suddenly Jeremy walks in. His hair shaved, they changed his name, and he said, Clifford, I feel at home here. And I said, okay, if that's the way you feel, Jeremy, I'll notify your parents, and best of luck, you know.
Frustrated at this latest setback, the band started holding auditions for a new guitarist. On their list of names was Bob Welsh, an American living in Paris.
Judy Wong calls me up from London and says, Bob, Jeremy Spencer's disappeared in front of the Whiskey A Go-Go, and you know, the second guitar player they've lost in a year and a half, and could you come over and meet everybody? And she was good friends with everybody in Fleetwood Mac. Well, I said, Judy, if you send me the plane ticket, because I have no money, I will come. And so I did.
I always felt Bob was a very insecure guy. He'd sort of lived hand to mouth for many years in France. But his aim was to become the leader of Fleetwood Mac. That was his aim.
Thanks to Welsh's style, the band's next album, 1971's Future Games, was less bluesy and more rock than anything they'd done before.
Musically, I don't think he added a lot personally. I've listened recently to his contributions, and to me they don't match up. Sentimental Lady, lovely song, I think it was the best song he wrote, but Night Watch was the only other track that I thought was good.
Bob Welsh, to me, was the guy who made Fleetwood Mac palatable for American audiences. Most people, looking back now, think that Fleetwood Mac begin in the mid-'70s and have that Southern California sound with Buckingham Nicks. But of course, there is this interval between the English success and establishing themselves in America. And Bob Welsh is the key intermediary figure here.
With a larger U.S. audience came greater monetary success and an accompanying increase in drinking and drug-taking. The biggest culprit of excess was guitarist Danny Kerwin, who was becoming unmanageable.
He acted in a very, very strange way. Eventually, Mick and John had to fire him. I mean, he got off the stage one day and just let them play and started applauding them from the audience, you know, in the middle of an American tour. So, I mean, I don't blame them, but they stood it for a long time, but he was a very sick boy.
Just as Fleetwood Mac had reached a new plateau of rock and roll success, they were forced to regroup for the 6th time in 5 years. In the summer of 1972, Just after releasing their 5th and most successful album, Bare Trees, Fleetwood Mac's already troubled lineup was devastated when one of their guitarists, Danny Kerwin, was forced to leave the band after a mental breakdown brought on by drugs and drink.
It's the crazy aspect of Fleetwood Mac that they're named after the rhythm section. And they're the constants, but all the people who play the guitar and sing the songs and write the songs, in and out, moving vans all over the place.
Founder members Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, along with guitarist Bob Welsh and keyboard player Christine Perfect, who had now become McVie's wife, scrambled to find a replacement for Kerwin. What they came up with was guitarist Bob Weston and singer Dave Walker, who had formerly fronted for rock band Savoy Brown.
Dave Walker was a great. He'd come on in his snakeskin boots and his turquoise jewelry. Yeah, hello Boston, what's going on? Hey, how are you? And he'd sing "Going Down," and he was, the black hair, just rough and just a great frontman. So we stole him basically from Savoy Brown.
They knew that they needed this charismatic leader, and on stage, I mean, the shows were like phenomenal.
The new lineup only made one album together, Penguin, released in 1973. All seemed well, but Walker's presence was upsetting the dynamic of the band. After only 8 months, Mick Fleetwood and John McVie asked him to leave.
The main reason Dave was asked to leave is because we just realized it just did not fit the Fleetwood Mac deal. It just didn't fit, not because he wasn't a sweetheart or anything, or a good singer.
I loved him as a guy. He was a really nice man. Very straight. If you didn't like something, he just told you, and I like that in people.
Now back to 5 members, Fleetwood Mac struggled to put out their next album, Mystery to Me. Mostly because John and Christine McVie's 4-year marriage was coming apart at the seams and made working together nearly impossible.
They would battle. They would have their rows, and when we went on the road, of course they were man and wife, so they were in the same room. It's very difficult to work with your spouse, I can imagine. And I remember one time where there was a round Holiday Inn, and I heard this commotion going on outside in the hallway after the show, which is the time when people are most likely to be, pissed out of their brains. And it was John and Chris in the hallway having a huge argument. John was actually running around the hallway with, I don't know if it was a butcher knife, but it was a knife.
We had no problems prior to me joining the band. I think that we were actually really happy.
The McVie's dissolving relationship caused Christine to pen the hit single, Why, which along with Bob Welsh's Hypnotized, helped make Mystery to Me their most popular album yet. By the time Fleetwood Mac hit the road to promote Mystery to Me, the McVie's problems suddenly took a back seat. When Mick Fleetwood discovered that Jenny, his wife of only 2 years, was having an affair with guitarist Bob Weston.
Bob was really the instigator of his own downfall. Lovely guy, nice guitar player. Unfortunately, you don't mess around with the boss's wife, and that's what Bob did. As a result of that, Mick found out, and he was fired.
With virtually the entire band incapacitated by personal problems, it was left to Bob Welsh to call their manager Clifford Davis and explain that they were canceling the tour and breaking up. Manager Davis was in a quandary. Canceling the tour would cost him and the band members a small fortune in fines and lawsuits. Knowing how unstable the band was, he had previously convinced them to sign all rights to their name over to him. Davis then hired a group of unknown musicians to complete the tour, performing under the name Fleetwood Mac. He told both the press and Warner Brothers that it was only a stopgap while the band took a rest.
All I would say on that is that this happened 33 years ago. The Fleetwood Mac as it existed at that time split up completely. The only one who wanted to continue was Mick. Mick and I entered into an agreement which cost me a tremendous amount of money. It cost me over 100 grand to put it into practice. I'd managed this guy for 7 years. I had no reason to think that a handshake was not sufficient. I kept my end of the bargain. Unfortunately, Mick didn't keep his.
Fleetwood Mac's loyal fans were now paying their hard-earned money to see a counterfeit band.
What people don't know is that they settled out of court. I kept everything I owned, and we went our separate ways.
Highly unpleasant, trying to basically prove that we were Fleetwood Mac, which was pretty ironic, considering my name's Fleetwood.
We had gone through a horrific lawsuit, which Mick and I mainly handled ourselves. There were attorneys involved, but I made all the calls, along with Mick, to Mo Austin from England, who was the head of Warner Brothers at the time. We weren't allowed to record under the name Fleetwood Mac, but we needed the money, the advance money, to make the album anyway, so, you know, we managed to do that, but then got an injunction to stop the funding. Anyway, I was mentally exhausted from the lawsuit.
When the band reformed, the new lineup included Mick Fleetwood, Bob Welch, and John and Christine McVie, who agreed to perform despite their marital problems. Thanks to Bob Welch's behind-the-scenes work, Fleetwood Mac had its name back. Fleetwood and McVie were their own managers, and the group was once again recording and performing. In October 1974, they released the album Heroes Are Hard to Find, and were preparing to go on tour when the long-suffering Welsh dropped a bombshell.
I wanted to move on musically. I wanted to do my version of Led Zeppelin. That was my idea of what would be just the greatest thing in the world. The other, Mick and everybody else at Fleetwood Mac, were not so appreciative of wanting to, they didn't want to go in that direction. So that's the main reason I left.
If Bob, who I did interview once very pleasantly, and who made some nice records, had hopes of changing Fleetwood Mac into Led Zeppelin, they would have been doomed. And also, Led Zeppelin were still there.
I remember John saying, you know, Bob, you know, this will be, you'll regret it. And I know now what he means.
Bob Welch was an important figure because he laid the groundwork for their acceptability in the United States. You don't hear people talk about him now because he wasn't on board for the big hits. But without him, either it wouldn't have happened or they would have had to find somebody else to do his job.
In the 7 years of their existence, Fleetwood Mac had endured 11 changes in personnel. No lineup had managed to stay together for more than 2 years. Could any band in the world survive so much turmoil? It was 1974, and Fleetwood Mac had already gone through 11 personnel changes when guitarist Bob Welch decided that he too wanted to leave the band. Mick Fleetwood desperately needed a replacement, and as luck would have it, he bumped into Sound City PR man Keith Olsen.
I was in a grocery store, and this guy came up who I vaguely knew and said, "Oh, I'm doing PR. What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm looking for studios." He said, "Just so happens I'm doing PR, hustling for this studio," which was Sound City.
Olsen pulled out a demo tape made by two of his friends, a duet from San Francisco called Buckingham Nicks.
Keith Olsen, who had engineered and co-produced the album that Stevie and I had done, was playing a song from that album for him at top volume. So I walked into Studio A, and here's Mick Fleetwood going, like, you know, listening to this guitar solo, and I shook hands with him, and then the song was over, and went back to Studio B.
I phoned up Keith Olsen at the studio and said, what was Lindsay doing? And then I truly gathered that they came as a package.
Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham had worked together on and off for years. By the time Mick Fleetwood visited Olsen's studio, Lindsey was still plugging away at the act, while Stevie was cleaning houses to pay the bills. Mick was immediately impressed with Buckingham's guitar work and writing abilities, but he and John McVie were only interested in a guitar player. They had Christine McVie. They didn't need another female vocalist. It took quite a bit of convincing, but eventually Fleetwood Mac took on both Buckingham and Nicks.
I liked them a lot as people, and as a duo, as front people, they were like, took it up a quantum jump. They were the John and Ethel Barrymore. They had a charisma and a fascination for people that I can understand. That just, you're either born with it or you're not, and they were.
When Stevie and Lindsay came, it changed the whole dynamic of the band, you know. It was like, boom.
Their first album together, 1975's Fleetwood Mac, would prove just how viable that sound was. The album hit #1, but beneath the glory lay continued conflict.
John and Christine, who had been married, were in the process of breaking up. Stevie and I, who had been living together for a number of years, were in the process of breaking up.
As they had always done, Fleetwood Mac's members turned their personal little hells into hit songs.
It was known that Lindsay and Stevie had been together. It was known that John and Christine had been together, which adds this free song. What do the words mean to each of these songs? How are they regarding themselves on stage tonight? The only group I can think of that's comparable was ABBA in its latter-day period, when people would think, okay, what are the dynamics tonight? You see, this is where the people who came into the group after Buckingham Nicks couldn't compare. They did not have the soap opera. It was the music without the sex.
From the Fleetwood Mac soap opera came their 16th album, Rumors. Emotionally charged songs like Go Your Own Way and Dreams made Rumors one of the best-selling albums of all time. Earned the group Rolling Stone magazine's Artist of the Year and Best Album awards, along with a Grammy for Album of the Year. Throughout the 7-month promo tour for Rumors, Fleetwood Mac reigned as the world's premier rock and roll band.
Rumors is one of the best albums ever. And it's just one of those miracle albums where each of the contributing members of the group is at peak. The interesting thing about that is neither of them could have known the others were at peak until they actually got together to make the record. Each of the 3 writers brings their 4 songs, or however it's divided, and you can think, gee, you know, this is really the best I've ever done. But you have no idea that, gee, it's the best she's ever done, and it's the best he's ever done. But they all peaked at the same time.
As the band took a well-earned rest after the Rumors tour, Lindsey Buckingham locked himself away in his home studio and started to experiment with overdubbing. What emerged would be the sound for the group's next album, Tusk. However, it took Buckingham nearly a year to convince Mick Fleetwood that this strange new sound was the way to go.
Tusk is the ultimate example, in the minds of rock critics, of a double album that should have been a single. Because had it been a single, it would not have received the criticism that it did. And it received a lot of criticism. Overproduced, too experimental. And you have that huge drop-off in sales. It's an awesome drop-off in sales.
I was one of those guys that had the blank CD when Tusk came out, so I could record it off the radio.
Nobody, I think I'm safe in saying this, really understood why they had the USC marching band on the record.
In the end, Tusk sold only 4 million copies, a far cry from the monster sales of 19 million achieved by its predecessor, Rumors. Despite the comparative failure of Tusk, Fleetwood Mac had proven that they were true professionals and could lay their personal problems aside and concentrate on making music. After years of constant upheaval, they had a stable, hit-making lineup of talented musicians. But if they thought their troubles were behind them, they were sadly mistaken. By 1980, it looked like Fleetwood Mac's long-running lineup problems were behind them. With Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks now in the band, and mega-hit albums Fleetwood Mac and Rumors, the band took their rightful place among the world's top rock groups. All they had to worry about now were the private problems which continued to plague their lives. Their next album, Mirage, was as experimental as their last release, Tusk. But unlike Tusk, it zoomed to #1 in the US charts and #5 in the UK, making it their 3rd #1 album in 5 years since Buckingham and Nicks joined the band.
It's a great comeback. It's not as great as Rumors, but they're all still making quality music together.
Although the band were riding high after the success of Mirage, predictably, all was not well behind the scenes. Mick Fleetwood declared himself bankrupt.
Mick, with his self confessed or self-professed. I don't really know the way in which he meant it, but nonetheless, he admitted he'd blown nearly $1 million on drugs.
It went on real estate.
At the same time, Stevie Nicks voluntarily entered a drug rehabilitation clinic, and John McVie suffered severe seizures brought on by decades of heavy drinking. While the group tried to pull their shattered lives together, the press and fan magazines speculated wildly as to whether or not Fleetwood Mac had finally broken up for good.
When I met them, they were going through some changes in the romantic dynamics within the band. And they were all very candid about it too, you know. I was there, I think, primarily to get history and to talk about the formation of the band, the evolution of the band, then the entrance of Buckingham and Nicks, and all of that, but it often ventured into more personal matters. That's the kind of kids they were.
It took the kids another 5 years before they reassembled for their next album, Tango in the Night.
Interestingly different reception in Britain and America. Number 1 in Britain, number 7 in America, even though there were 4 big hits from the record. Certainly not an adventurous album, more a celebratory mellow album. But I love Seven Wonders, I love Everywhere. It's a beautiful listen.
Although the album was commercially successful, Lindsey Buckingham said he was too exhausted and creatively frustrated to go on tour. Finally, after a furious row with Mick Fleetwood, he quit the band.
I hope that Lindsey finds what he is searching for, and I hope that he's happy.
After a dozen years, Fleetwood Mac's most popular and enduring lineup, Mick Fleetwood, John and Christine McVie, Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham, had ceased to exist. Buckingham was replaced by 2 musicians, lead guitarist Rick Vito and the son of legendary Dorsey Burnett, rhythm player Billy Burnett.
I got the call to join the band. The dad was in the studio with Roy Orbison, with Rick Vito. And Mick had said, hey, can you get that boy that played on that session not too long ago? And I go, yeah, he just happens to be in the studio here with us. So it was quite a day for me. I mean, being in the studio with Roy Orbison doing one of my songs and being invited to join Fleetwood Mac.
I had met Mick off and on through the years and had done a session with him. And we talked about the early Mac and my love for Peter Green. And of course, Mick loves Peter, you know. So I think we were sort of had a little kindred spirit thing going there. And when Lindsey left, they had Billy lined up, of course, because Billy had worked with Mick in the Zoo. But he not being a lead guitarist, he suggested to the rest of the band that I come down and see what happened then.
Vito would have had to have been a great guitar player to maintain interest in the group when the leading figures were gone, to avoid it just being Mick and John with Chuck Berry's pickup band.
The first album with the new lineup, Behind the Mask, was a radical departure from the experimental style developed during the Buckingham years. Rick Vito had never spent so much time in the studio.
It's a long process because they really take their time. We took a year to do a record where I'm naturally, you know, I like to do something in a day.
It was a great way to record. You know, they were real meticulous about things they put on. And
well, I guess there's a lot at stake when you've sold 100 million records of Rumors or something like that, you know. So we did want to make sure that they took the time.
Now, if you've been in Fleetwood Mac for a long time and you're accustomed to 43 takes, you're with the spirit of the operation. But if you're new and you've grown up in a different way, this is going to seem really strange, a waste of time, a sign of weakness.
While some critics savaged their new sound, Rolling Stone said Vito and Burnett were the best thing that ever happened to Fleetwood Mac. Whatever the case, the new lineup would prove as short-lived as some of their earlier incarnations. Just after the sold-out Behind the Mask World Tour, and after 4 years as lead guitarist with Fleetwood Mac, Rick Vito abruptly announced he was leaving the band.
I was welcomed into that situation with much more heart than I ever anticipated. So it was really, really fun. Really, really fun. I'll always cherish that time.
At the same time, longtime Fleetwood Mac stalwart Christine McVie announced she would no longer tour with the band, and Stevie Nicks quit altogether after a row with Mick Fleetwood. With 11 major shakeups in 24 years, Fleetwood Mac's loyal fans were wondering if this was finally the end of the road. By 1991, the ever-popular Fleetwood Mac had recorded 23 albums. But age was not mellowing the rockers as they approached the quarter-century mark. They were again in complete disarray. Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks had both quit, as had their lead guitarist Rick Vito. The only long-time remaining members were founders Mick Fleetwood, John McVie, and his now ex-wife Christine. And even she would no longer go on tour. Over the years, Fleetwood Mac had frequently pulled back from the brink at the very last minute, and the current crisis would be no exception. This time, however, the catalyst for their reforming would be no less than the new President of the United States, Bill Clinton. Throughout his campaign, Clinton had used Mac's old standard, Don't Stop, as his theme song, and he asked the band to play it at his 1993 inauguration. For the celebration concert, Fleetwood Mac introduced guitarist Dave Mason, formerly of Traffic, and the daughter of 60s pop artist Bonnie and Delaney, vocalist Becca Bramlett.
Becca, when I think we were hanging out one night in Malibu, Mick's studio.
And I got up, I used to get up all the time and sing with my dad. And they were there, and Fleetwood Mac, and
Mick went, wow.
I got a phone call saying that, while Fleetwood Mac isn't doing their thing, Mick has this hiatus band called The Zoo. Would I come?
Well, I think she and her mother are both incredible singers, just incredible. They've got that R&B thing and gospel thing, and it seems so effortless to them. Wonderful.
The Becca coming in is another example, I think, of Mick Fleetwood's resourcefulness. It was his resourcefulness that said, well, let's put Fleetwood Mac together with a great, blonde, cute girl singer and with some other people, and let's go out there and do it and see what happens, and that's Mick.
Mick Fleetwood had an uncanny talent for putting the right people in the right places. Never front and center himself, he was always more than happy to sit in the background.
Why wouldn't he be happy? Just think, I'm a drummer and I have all these hits and I'm making all this money and I'm not writing anything and it's happening all around me.
Mick Fleetwood, I'm not a music critic, so I'm not one to talk about his technique or his virtuosity or skill or anything. I think it speaks a lot, though, about him that he was able to be the foundation, part of the rhythmic foundation of a band that went through so many different kinds of music through all these many years. So I think that says a lot about his skill.
Well, I could tell you a few things. No. Mick's the sort of big brother or paternal figure, however you want to classify him. But he's just he's a very charismatic fellow. First of all, he's about 6'7" or something like that. He's a big guy. So his presence alone, when he walks in any room, heads are going to turn anyway, let alone you realize it's Mick, Mick's always the guy he's the idea man, He always comes up with, let's try this, this would be great, let's go out and look at this person, or, let's try this or that, and it's infectious.
Now back in the studio after 3 years, they recorded a new album, Time.
We had a lot of cool, eclectic ideas going, like me and Billy had more southern rocky, kind of country-ish, more flavor-ish kind of stuff going on. Mick was just totally happy to be 100% always involved, and John was just freaking me out, with the bass parts that he was coming up with. I'd always want to be there when John was playing the bass parts, because it was just like, what? This little white English fella, man, you're just going, you are the soulfullest cat ever, dude, wow. And I just remember, it was great, yeah.
It took Warner Brothers nearly a year to release the Time album, and they provided virtually no promotional support for the ensuing tour. Exhausted, disillusioned, and frustrated, Fleetwood Mac disbanded for the 4th time. But only months later, Mick Fleetwood announced that he and John McVie were again working with Lindsey Buckingham, Christine McVie, and Stevie Nicks. Fleetwood Mac's greatest ever lineup were back together once again. The release of their new album, The Dance, was preceded by a massively successful MTV special, and both the album and 37-city reunion tour returned Fleetwood Mac to center stage of the pop world. Just as the tour came to an end in '98, Fleetwood Mac was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Included in the induction was not only the band's most famous lineup, but earlier members Peter Green, Jeremy Spencer, and Danny Kerwin, who had all contributed to more than 3 decades of Fleetwood Mac's unique sound.
Well, look at the history. You know, it's been around for 40 years this year. This is the 40th anniversary. So, you know, they're wonderful people. Mick Fleetwood is a wonderful guy. He's still somebody I enjoy hanging out with and playing with.
It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing their fans stick with them as long as they do, too. I mean, Stevie's fans are just, you know, diehard. Fleetwood Mac fans are. I mean, they're fans forever. I mean, you know, you hit the stage with those guys, and it's pretty wild.
In 2003, the band released their first album in 8 years, the 18-track CD, Say You Will. This album was also the first time Lindsey Buckingham had joined them in the studio since 1987.
You see, I'm glad they made their last album, even though it didn't have any big hits in it, because Peacemaker became the first single to make the Billboard Hot 100 sheerly on the basis of download. There was no physical record. So they're in the history books for something which to them is minor. But I like that.
After more than 40 years in the music business, the only founding members still with the band are Mick Fleetwood and John McVie. Over the decades, 14 other musicians and vocalists have worked with them. Together they produced 26 albums and sold more than 100 million records, making Fleetwood Mac undoubtedly one of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time.
I would say overall, they were the purveyors of very, very commercial, good music.
When you're flipping and press and seek, and a Fleetwood Mac song comes on, you don't keep pressing. You listen to that song. I don't know anybody who doesn't. That's got to say something.
I think when people are reminded about them and about a few songs from over the course of their history, then they go, yeah, that is one amazing achievement. That is a great band, and those are some of my favorite songs. So that's a pretty good legacy to have.
It was just an interesting band, and I think reflected the times and the musical times, and full of strong personalities that had a lot of interesting things to say.
Well, that's tough. Dynasty.
Honesty would be the word. I do think that they mean everything they play and sing. I've seen it.
Sad is the word. Sad because I would give it all up for Peter Green to be well, all of it, if I could do that, but I can't.
Rumors. Not only because that's the name of their biggest selling album, but because the biggest interest in the group concerns Rumors. What is Stevie Nicks really up to? What are Buckingham and Nicks onto together? Where was Peter Green's head at? What did happen to those original guys? Rumors. This is a group where there are multiple mysteries.